It's 1147 BCE, and you're standing in front of the Kenbet, the local court. In a mud-brick hall at Deir el-Medina, you've been accused of stealing a copper chisel from a coworker's toolkit. There's no lawyer. There's no jury. There's a panel of your own neighbors, farmers, scribes, foremen, sitting in judgment. And one of them is the man who accused you. You are about to find out that ancient Egyptian justice ran on something stranger and more rigorous than fear of the pharaoh. It ran on a concept so central to Egyptian civilization that breaking the law wasn't just a crime against another person. It was a crime against the fabric of reality itself. Here's the picture most people have of justice in ancient Egypt. An all-powerful god-king points a finger, and you're mutilated, exiled, or executed on a whim. Arbitrary, theatrical. The pharaoh's mood as law. That's wrong. And it's wrong in a specific, revealing way. Ancient Egypt ran one of the most methodical legal systems in the ancient world. Courts, testimony, precedent, appeals. Something close to due process 3,000 years before most of the world had any of that in writing. The pharaoh sat at the top of it, technically the source of all law. But in practice, most Egyptians who broke a law never saw him. They saw a panel of local elders, a scribe taking notes on limestone flakes, and a system built around a single idea that shaped everything downstream of it. Maat. Maat wasn't just the law. It was truth, order, and cosmic balance. The force that kept the sun rising, the Nile flooding on schedule, and society from sliding into chaos. Every crime from a stolen chisel to grave robbery was framed as an act of isfit, disorder, thrown against Maat. And that framing is what made Egyptian punishment so much stranger, and in some cases so much harsher than anything a modern court would hand down. Because you weren't just facing your neighbors. Eventually you'd face Osiris. So here's where we're going. How the courts actually worked. What counted as a crime and what didn't. What happened to your body if you were found guilty. And what happened to your soul if the crime was bad enough that this life's punishment wasn't the end of it. By the finish you'll understand why grave robbing terrified Egyptians more than almost anything else. And why the harshest trial in Egyptian history wasn't about theft at all. It was an attempt to kill a god. Let's go. Move 1. The system nobody expects. Forget the image of Pharaoh as judge, jury, and executioner. Most legal disputes in Egypt were handled at the local level by a body called the Kenbet, a panel of town elders, officials, and respected community members who heard cases, weighed evidence, and issued a verdict based on precedent and common sense. At Deir el-Medina, the workers' village that built the royal tombs, the Kenbet was made up of the workers' own foremen and colleagues. If you had a dispute over a stolen tool, unpaid wages, or a boundary line, this is where it went. If you didn't like the local verdict, you could escalate. Above the Kenbet sat the Vizier, the pharaoh's chief minister and effectively the supreme court judge for the entire country. The Vizier's decision was close to final, and appealing to him wasn't free of risk. If you brought a weak case just to buy time or annoy an opponent, your punishment could increase rather than decrease. Above even the Vizier in theory was the pharaoh himself, but he mostly appeared in the record for the cases that mattered to the state. Tomb robbery, conspiracy, treason. For an ordinary Egyptian, the Vizier's court was the ceiling. And here's the detail that surprises people most. Women could bring cases, testify, and be tried under exactly the same laws as men. Property could pass through the female line. And there are surviving records of women independently taking men to court and winning. That's not universal in the ancient world. It's not even universal today. Move 2. What actually got you dragged in front of the Kenbet? The vast majority of Egyptian court cases were not the dramatic stuff. They were land disputes, water rights along the Nile, arguments over inheritance, unpaid debts, and workplace theft, exactly like our chisel thief at the beginning. We know this because the workers of Deir el-Medina wrote everything down on limestone flakes called ostraca, thousands of which survive. Absences from work, grudges between neighbors, who owed who a jar of beer. Punishment for these everyday crimes was usually proportional and practical. Restitution meaning you paid back what you took, sometimes at a multiple of its value. A beating with a stick administered on the spot was extremely common, and treated less like torture and more like a fine you paid with your body. Forced labor was reserved for more serious repeat offenses. What Egyptian law rarely reached for with ordinary theft was mutilation or death. Those punishments existed, but they were saved for a specific category of crime. The kind that didn't just break a rule. It broke the universe. Move 3. And this is the crime that terrified Egyptians more than any other. Tomb robbery. To understand why, you have to understand what a tomb actually was to an Egyptian. It wasn't a grave. It was a machine for eternal life, stocked with everything the soul needed in the afterlife. Food, tools, jewelry. Sometimes gold, masks, and furniture worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. Rob a tomb, and you weren't just stealing property. You were potentially destroying someone's chance at eternity and inviting the wrath of every god associated with the dead. Late in the New Kingdom, around 1110 BCE, the scale of the problem exploded. Egypt was politically unstable. Food was scarce, and the guards protecting the Valley of the Kings were underpaid or complicit. The result is one of the best documented crime waves in the ancient world, recorded in a set of court papyri, the Abbott Papyrus and the Amherst and Leopold Papyri among them, which describe official investigations into the plundering of royal tombs. The investigations were brutal. Suspects were interrogated, and the surviving records describe beatings with a double rod and blows to the feet and hands used to extract confessions. In one case, a group of men confessed to breaking into the tomb of King Sobekmsaf II and were made to physically walk the investigators back to the tomb to identify the scene of the crime, a kind of forced reenactment. And it turned out the corruption went far higher than the robbers themselves. The mayor in charge of protecting the West Bank necropolis was accused by a rival official of being complicit in the thefts. 17 temple workmen were eventually convicted and executed. The accused mayor himself was never charged for lack of clear evidence and kept his job while the robberies continued. Ancient Egyptian justice, it turns out, had exactly the same blind spot every justice system since has had. The people with the most power to stop a crime are often the hardest to actually convict of it. Move 4. If tomb robbery was a crime against eternity, this next one was a crime against the state itself. And it happened inside the most protected building in Egypt. Around 1155 BCE, a group of conspirators inside the royal harem plotted to assassinate Pharaoh Ramesses III. The plan was organized by one of his secondary wives, a woman named Tai, who wanted her son placed on the throne instead of the officially chosen heir. She recruited palace officials, army officers, harem staff, and reportedly magicians who prepared wax figures and poison, meant to be smuggled past palace security. Modern examination of Ramesses III's mummy found his throat had been cut to the bone. The conspiracy worked. He died. It just didn't get the conspirators what they wanted, because his chosen successor still took the throne as Ramesses IV, and immediately convened a trial. What survives from that trial, a document called the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, is one of the most detailed court records from the ancient world. Around 40 people were charged with the greatest possible crime in Egyptian law, plotting to overthrow their lord, alongside charges of practicing hostile magic against the king. The punishments were sorted by rank and guilt. Some were executed outright. Others, including Tai's own son, were sentenced to take their own lives. A punishment that sounds merciful until you realize the alternative. In Egyptian belief, could mean your body was burned to ash entirely, denying you any kind of afterlife at all. And in the middle of the trial, the story gets even stranger. Several of the 12 judges appointed to try the conspirators were caught fraternizing and drinking with the accused women. It was considered such a severe violation that the judges themselves were arrested and tried, and at least one was left to take his own life for it. Egypt's most secure trial in its history turned out to have corruption baked into its own bench. Move 5. There's one more case that matters here because it flips the entire premise of everything we've covered. What happens when the workers, not the criminals, are the ones being wronged? Around 1155 BCE, the same craftsmen who built the royal tombs at Deir el-Medina were owed their standard payment, bread and beer. And the state simply didn't deliver it on time. So they did something almost nobody in the ancient world is recorded doing before them. They stopped working. They marched to the mortuary temples, sat down, and refused to leave until they were paid. In what's now considered the earliest documented labor strike in human history. And crucially, they didn't just riot. They made their case through the same legal channels everyone else used, appealing to officials, putting their grievance on the record. The strike worked. Wages eventually came through, which tells you something important about Egyptian law that the tomb robbery and harem cases don't. It wasn't purely a tool the state used against its people. Under the right conditions, ordinary Egyptians could use it right back. Move 6. All of this, the beatings, the mutilations, the executions, was actually the smaller half of Egyptian justice. Because for a religious Egyptian, this life's court was just the preliminary round. Egyptians believed that after death your heart, thought to be the seat of memory, morality, and intention, was placed on one side of a scale in the hall of the god Osiris. On the other side sat a single feather, the symbol of Maat herself. Before the weighing, you were required to recite the negative confessions, a list of 42 specific sins you swore you hadn't committed. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not told lies. I have not caused anyone pain. If your heart was heavier than the feather, weighed down by guilt and wrongdoing, it wasn't sent to a fiery underworld the way later religions imagined punishment. It was devoured on the spot by a creature called Maat, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. And your consciousness simply ceased to exist. No afterlife. No second chance. Total erasure. Compared to that, a beating from the Kenbet suddenly looks almost gentle. And here's what ties every single one of these stories together. From the stolen chisel to the murdered pharaoh, Egyptian law was never really about punishing you. It was about restoring balance. Maat wasn't a metaphor to these people. It was treated as an actual force holding the universe together. The same force that made the Nile flood on schedule and the sun rise the next morning. A crime was a small tear in that fabric. And the punishment, whether it was repayment, a beating, mutilation, or your own name being erased from a tomb wall, existed to sew the tear back up, not to satisfy anger. That's why tomb robbery and conspiracy against the pharaoh carried the harshest penalties on the books. They weren't just property crimes or political crimes. In the Egyptian worldview, they were attacks on the order of reality itself. And the state responded to them exactly the way you'd respond to something that threatened to unmake the world. So back to our chisel thief. Standing in front of the Kenbet at Deir el-Medina, the verdict comes down. Restitution. And a beating with a stick. Administered right there. In front of the panel of neighbors who now know exactly what you did. Painful. Humiliating. And compared to what a tomb robber or a would-be regicide was facing, almost survivable. You walk away that afternoon with a sore back and a debt to repay. Still very much intact for the trial that actually mattered. The one waiting for you after you die? Would you have taken the chisel? Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon.